The silent agony of abandonment etched itself onto the raw landscape, a desolate testament to a world that had forgotten. Here, beneath an indifferent sky, a child's last tears mingled with the prairie dust, a lone cry swallowed by the vast, unforgiving expanse. This is the story of a fragile life, poised on the knife edge of oblivion, until an unlikely hand reached out. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The wind, a relentless sculptor of the plains, carved its mournful song around the small, crumpled figure. Dust, fine as a forgotten memory, coated everything: the cracked earth, the brittle prairie grass, and the small, still body of Ayana. Her world, once vibrant with the rhythmic pulse of her people, had dissolved into this agonizing void. Every breath was a rasping plea, every heartbeat a drum against the silence of a life violently stripped bare. She had watched, hidden by the benevolent tall grass, as the last of her kin vanished, not into the embrace of the earth, but into the relentless maw of the unknown. Her tears, no longer a flood but a slow, persistent seep, traced paths through the grime on her cheeks, each drop a tiny, bitter testament to a sorrow too vast for her young frame. The sun, a brutal orb in the azure expanse, beat down with an indifferent intensity, baking the very air she struggled to breathe. Her small hands, once quick to gather berries or weave intricate patterns, now lay limp, caked with dirt, mirroring the impotence of her spirit. Around her the endless horizon shimmered, an oppressive promise of more nothingness, more isolation. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call, felt like a mocking whisper of a life that continued without her. She was a forgotten echo, a whisper on the wind, waiting for the final erasure. Her small, thin chest rose and fell with a shallow, uneven rhythm, a fragile defiance against the encroaching darkness. Her eyes, once bright with childish wonder, were now dull, reflecting only the vast, empty sky above. The silence, broken only by the incessant wind, pressed down upon her, heavy and suffocating, a blanket woven from despair and the chilling embrace of true aloneness. She yearned for a touch, a voice, a sign that the world had not utterly forgotten the small, broken heart beating feebly within her. The prairie, her birthplace and now her potential tomb, offered only the stark beauty of neglect. Elias, a man etched by the sun and scarred by the world's indifference, walked the rails with the practiced gait of one who had learned to measure life in iron ties and endless horizons. His work, laying track across this unforgiving land, was a brutal monotony, yet it offered a stark simplicity. Hammer, steel, dust, repeat. He preferred the predictability of the rails to the volatile chaos of human interactions. Born Métis, a blend of worlds, he found solace in the liminal spaces, the in-between, just as the rails themselves spanned territories that belonged to no one and everyone. His face, weathered and unreadable, concealed a quiet resentment, a deep-seated weariness born from a lifetime of being neither fully one nor the other, always an outsider looking in. The glint of steel beneath the midday sun was often the only beacon in his solitary existence, a cold comfort in the vast, empty expanse. He had seen many things out here, things that spoke of man's cruelty and the land's unforgiving nature, but nothing had ever prepared him for the sight that greeted him amidst the sparse sagebrush. A flicker of movement, barely discernible against the dusty ochre of the earth, pulled him from his rhythmic trance. It was a child, impossibly small, a discarded doll slumped against a gnarled skeletal bush. His breath caught, a sudden sharp intake of air that burned his lungs. The image, stark and devastating, was a cruel mirror of the world's indifference, a chilling tableau of desolation, a wave of an emotion he rarely indulged. Something akin to raw, unvarnished empathy rippled through his hardened exterior, cracking the carefully constructed walls around his heart. He knew, with a certainty that was both chilling and profound, that this was not a sight he could simply walk away from. The rails, usually his escape, now seemed to stretch endlessly towards an unforeseen and utterly unavoidable confrontation with a fragile, forgotten life. He knelt, his calloused hands hovering, unsure how to approach such profound fragility. Ayana's silence was a fortress, impenetrable and ancient, built from the debris of unspeakable loss. She offered no words, only the stark, unsettling eloquence of her wide, hollow eyes that mirrored the prairie's vast emptiness. Elias, clumsy in his compassion, tried to coax her, offering water from his canteen, then a piece of dried jerky. She recoiled, a small instinctual flinch, a wild creature cornered. The camp, a temporary scar upon the landscape, offered little solace. Rough men, hardened by sun and whiskey, cast wary, suspicious glances. "Another mouth to feed, Elias," grumbled Foreman O'Malley, his voice a gravelly rasp. "The company pays us to lay track, not run an orphanage." O'Malley's words, sharp and dismissive, were the common currency of their existence, an unspoken decree that survival left no room for sentiment. Elias felt the familiar prickle of irritation, the weary burden of a world quick to judge, slow to understand. He knew their gazes were not just for Ayana, the strange, silent Pawnee child, but for him too, the Métis, the half-breed who dared to step outside the bounds of their rigid, unfeeling world. He remembered his own childhood, a constant dance on the edge of acceptance, perpetually alien, an echo of voices whispering half-blood behind cupped hands. His mother, strong and defiant, had taught him the silent language of endurance, how to weather the storm of prejudice without breaking. He recalled the sting of a thrown rock, the cold dismissal in a storekeeper's eyes, the casual cruelty of boys his own age. These fragments of memory, sharp and unbidden, fueled a quiet resolve within him. Ayana, with her haunted eyes, was not just a child. She was a reflection of a vulnerability he understood too well. He would not abandon her to the same indifferent winds that had shaped his own bitter path. He carefully scooped her up, her small body frighteningly light, a feather in his calloused hands. Her flinch was less pronounced this time, a tiny fissure in her wall of fear, and he clung to that minute sign as a man lost at sea clings to a distant shore. The weight of her fragility was a new kind of burden, heavy with responsibility, yet curiously light with an unfamiliar sense of purpose. Ayana, cocooned in the rough blanket Elias had salvaged, remained largely inert, a small, still point in the swirling chaos of the railroad camp. Her silence persisted, a shield against the overwhelming strangeness of her new reality. Yet, subtly, imperceptibly, a fragile tether began to form between them. When Elias brought her a tin plate of stew, she ate, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes fixed on some distant unseen point. She didn't look at him, but she didn't recoil either. He observed her, a silent sentinel, noting the way her small hand instinctively reached for the warmth of the fire, the slight tremor that ran through her when a train whistle shrieked. He spoke little, sensing her need for quiet, but his presence was a constant, a solid anchor in her adrift world. The other workers, initially curious, soon settled back into their weary routines, their glances less frequent, but still laced with a lingering, unspoken judgment. O'Malley, ever pragmatic, had given Elias a week. After that, he'd warned, she's a distraction, and distractions get people killed on these tracks. Elias understood the unspoken threat, the cold logic of survival. He knew he was walking a fine line, risking his own precarious position for a child who offered nothing but silent vulnerability. But a flicker of something akin to a spark, had ignited within him the moment he'd seen her. He found himself sketching in the dirt with a stick, simple shapes, a bird, a horse, a stick figure that was clearly a child. Her eyes, which rarely met his, followed the lines he drew, a faint, almost imperceptible curiosity stirring within their depths. One evening, as the stars began to pinprick the vast, dark canvas of the sky, he hummed a low, tuneless melody, a forgotten lullaby from his own distant childhood. Ayana, curled beside the flickering fire, shifted slightly. Her small, thin fingers, almost unconsciously, began to trace the rough outline of a button on his worn work shirt. It was a fleeting, tentative gesture, a feather-light touch, but to Elias, it felt like the breaking of a dam, a whisper across the chasm, the first fragile thread of trust. It was a promise, fragile as a spider's silk, that perhaps, just perhaps, life could find a way to bloom in the most desolate of places. Sleep offered Ayana no escape, only a different kind of torment. Fragmented images, sharp and brutal, tore through her slumber. The roar of hooves, the acrid smell of smoke, the panicked cries of her kin. She would wake, gasping, her small body rigid with terror, the phantom sounds echoing in the cavern of her mind. Elias, ever vigilant, would rise, a silent, comforting presence. He never pressed her for details, never forced her to relive the horrors, but simply offered a steady hand, a reassuring warmth that slowly, painstakingly coaxed her back from the precipice of her nightmares. He had his own ghosts, though different in origin, equally relentless. He remembered the sting of his father's disappointment, a man who saw his Métis heritage as a burden, a weakness to be overcome by sheer force of will. His father, a fur trader of Scottish descent, had tried to sever the threads that bound Elias to his mother's people, to the land, to the songs and stories that echoed in his blood. "You are a white man's son," he'd declared, his voice hard as flint, "and you'll make your way in a white man's world." But Elias had always felt the pull of the wilderness, the quiet wisdom of his mother's Cree kin, the vibrant tapestry of a culture that flowed beneath the surface of the imposed colonial order. He carried the burden of being caught between two colliding worlds, never fully accepted by either. This shared sense of being an outsider, a silent, unspoken understanding, deepened the unusual bond forming between him and the child. He would sit with her, sometimes for hours, watching the stars wheel across the immense sky, their silent companionship a balm against the world's harshness. He saw in her eyes the reflection of a profound loss, a chasm that no words could bridge. But he also saw a flicker, a stubborn ember of resilience. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that uncovering the truth of her past was not just a matter of curiosity, but a critical step towards her healing. The mystery, shrouded in her silence, was a heavy cloak, but he felt an almost desperate need to unravel its dark threads, not for himself, but for the small, haunted life that now depended on him. Her nightmares were a language he was slowly learning to understand, a story told in the desperate clench of her tiny fists, the silent scream that escaped her lips. As the railroad pushed further west, the small, transient community of workers approached Fort Laramie, a bustling hub of frontier life, but also a crucible of simmering racial tensions. The change in atmosphere was palpable, a thickening in the air. The casual glances of the other workers turned into open stares from the townspeople. Elias felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the dull ache of impending confrontation. He heard the whispers, sharp and cutting, as they walked through the dusty streets. "Look at the half-breed, got himself a wild one. Another savage mouth to feed." The words, flung like stones, hit with unerring accuracy. Ayana, usually so withdrawn, seemed to shrink further into herself, her small hand clutching Elias's trousers, her eyes darting nervously from face to face. He could feel her fear, a palpable tremor running through her small frame, and it ignited a cold fire within him. He met their gazes with a defiant stillness, his jaw clenched. The general store, usually a place of simple commerce, became a gauntlet. The storekeeper, a portly man with a perpetual sneer, eyed Ayana with open disdain. "We don't serve that kind here," he spat, his voice laced with venom. Elias's hand instinctively went to the knife at his belt, his knuckles white. The air crackled with unspoken violence, a sudden potent tension that threatened to ignite. His moral ambiguity was put to the test. Did he stand his ground, inviting further conflict and jeopardizing their already tenuous situation? Or did he swallow the insult, allowing the casual cruelty to fester? He saw the stark choice laid bare: protect her, truly protect her, or risk letting her drown in the very prejudice he had sought to shield her from. The silence in the store was heavy, broken only by Ayana's shallow, rapid breathing. His own past, a parade of slights and struggles, flashed before his eyes. He thought of his mother, resilient and proud, who would never have bowed to such casual bigotry. He thought of Ayana, a small innocent life, whose pain was already more than any child should bear. He made his choice, a silent, resolute vow. Ayana's world, once a vivid tapestry of prairie life, had been abruptly torn apart. In a searing flash of memory, more vivid than any nightmare, she saw it. The smoke-choked air, the chaotic scramble, the desperate pleas of her mother, and the stark, unblinking horror of the raiders' faces. She had been hidden, pushed into the deepest shadows beneath a gnarled cottonwood, her mother's hands trembling yet firm, covering her mouth to stifle her cries. She remembered the scent of fear, the sharp metallic tang of blood, and the final crushing weight of silence that descended after the screams had faded. Her people, scattered like dust, leaving her utterly, irrevocably alone. The memory, a raw wound, ripped through her carefully constructed silence, a small choked sob escaping her lips. Elias, watching her, felt the tremor that ran through her small body, saw the sudden stark terror in her eyes, and knew, with a chilling certainty, that the true story of her abandonment was finally breaking through. It was not mere neglect, but an act of brutal violence. His heart ached with a profound, almost unbearable empathy. The revelation hung heavy in the air, a dark cloud settling over them. He could send her to an orphanage, the local mission perhaps, where she would be cared for by strangers. Stripped of her identity, her spirit slowly eroded. He could leave her to the mercy of a system that saw her as little more than a nameless, faceless Indian child. Or he could keep her. The choice, stark and agonizing, presented itself as an abyss. Keeping her meant a life of uncertainty, a constant battle against the prevailing currents of society, a permanent severance from his own transient existence on the rails. It meant sacrificing the last vestiges of his solitary freedom, binding himself to a responsibility he had never sought. He was a man of the margins, and she was a child of the lost, a fragile echo of a vanishing world. He looked at her, truly looked, past the dirt and the fear into the depths of her soul, and saw a raw, beautiful resilience. The lines on his weathered face deepened, etched with the weight of the decision. He had run from so much in his life, from his past, from the expectations of others, from the very idea of attachment. But this was different. This was not about escape. It was about presence. He reached out, his hand hesitantly touching her small, trembling shoulder. "Ayana," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion, "you are not alone." The words, simple yet profound, sealed his fate. The world Elias had known, a life measured by the rhythmic clang of hammer on steel and the endless stretch of track, was now irrevocably altered. He turned his back on the foreman's gruff warnings, on the wary glances of his fellow workers, on the precarious stability his solitude had offered. The rails, once his path to nowhere, now symbolized a path abandoned, a choice made. He sold what little he had, his tools, his meager possessions, enough to buy a sturdy wagon, a single horse, and supplies for a journey whose destination remained largely undefined. Their journey became a quiet odyssey, across the vast undulating plains, a landscape that was both familiar and terrifying in its boundless emptiness. They moved with a deliberate slowness, an almost reverent pace, as if trying to mend the fabric of time that had been so violently torn for Ayana. Elias taught her how to recognize the subtle signs of the prairie, the wisdom of the wind, the language of the animals. He pointed out constellations at night, weaving stories from the stars, ancient tales that subtly mirrored the resilience of his own Métis ancestors. Ayana, in turn, slowly, tentatively began to emerge from her chrysalis of silence. She would point at a hawk soaring overhead, her finger trembling slightly, a small, inarticulate sound escaping her lips. She began to draw in the dust with a stick, mimicking the shapes Elias had taught her, but adding her own intricate patterns, echoing forgotten designs from her Pawnee heritage. He saw her spirit, a fragile, beautiful thing, slowly unfurling like a desert blossom after a long rain. The quiet moments around their nightly campfires became rituals of healing. He would hum the low, melodic songs his mother had sung, tunes that spoke of the land and endurance, and Ayana would listen, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames, a faint, almost imperceptible peace settling over her. Their shared existence was a delicate balance, a conversation carried not in words, but in glances, in shared silences, in the steadfast presence they offered each other. He was no longer just Elias, the Métis railroad worker. He was Ayana's anchor, her protector, the unwavering pole star in her disoriented world. And in return, she was slowly, unknowingly, becoming his reason, the beating heart of a future he had never dared to imagine for himself. Their journey was not just a physical movement across the land, but a profound, emotional migration towards a nascent hope. The journey west carried them away from the immediate threat of the established settlements, but not from the pervasive fear that clung to Ayana like a second skin. They sought a new life, a place where their blend of identities, one Métis, one Pawnee, might find a semblance of acceptance. Elias steered them towards the northern territories, whispers of a burgeoning Métis settlement near the Red River holding a fragile promise of community. Ayana, though growing stronger, still bore the indelible marks of her trauma. A sudden loud noise could still make her flinch, her small body recoiling with an almost visceral fear. The sight of a uniform, even from a distance, would send a shiver through her, her eyes widening with a terror that spoke of unspeakable past horrors. Yet, within these shadows, seeds of hope began to sprout. She began to speak, first in soft whispers, then in hesitant broken phrases. Her voice, thin and reedy, was a melody Elias had never expected to hear, each word a triumph over the choking silence that had once defined her. She would ask questions about the world around them. Her curiosity, long dormant, now rekindled. She learned to identify edible plants, to track small game, to read the nuanced language of the sky. She began to weave small, intricate braids into her hair, a subtle echo of her Pawnee heritage, a quiet reclaiming of her identity. Elias watched her with a profound, almost reverent awe, seeing the resilience of her spirit, the stubborn refusal to be broken. But the past, a relentless phantom, continued to cast its long shadow. He worried constantly about their discovery, about the authorities who might seek to relocate Ayana to an Indian school or a distant reservation. The open loops of their journey, the unanswered questions of their future, hung heavy in the air. Would they find true peace in this new land? Or was their fragile hope merely a temporary respite before the inevitable storm? The vastness of the plains, once a symbol of freedom, now also felt like an immense indifferent stage for their precarious existence. Every rustle of the wind a potential harbinger of discovery, every distant rider a potential threat. Their future remained an unwritten chapter, filled with the promise of a dawn, but also the lingering echoes of a dark and unresolved past. The Red River settlement, a collection of humble cabins and hardy souls, offered a temporary sanctuary, a fragile haven in a world still largely hostile. For a fleeting season, Ayana and Elias found a semblance of peace, a quiet rhythm in the heart of a community that, though wary, understood the plight of outsiders. Ayana blossomed, her laughter, once a foreign sound, now echoing in the clear prairie air. She learned to speak more freely, her Pawnee language slowly weaving itself with the mischief of the Métis. Elias, too, found a quiet contentment, his gruff exterior softening in the warmth of shared purpose. But peace in that harsh era was a fickle mistress. One autumn afternoon, a stranger arrived, a grim-faced man with the authority of the Indian Agency etched into his stern features. He had heard whispers, he claimed, of a stray Pawnee child and a Métis renegade living beyond official notice. The air immediately crackled with an unspoken tension, the easy camaraderie of the settlement dissolving into wary silence. This was the pivotal emotional climax, the confrontation they had both subconsciously dreaded. The agent, a figure of cold, bureaucratic power, saw Ayana not as a child, but as a statistic, an anomaly to be catalogued and contained. He demanded her surrender, citing government mandates, the best interests of the child, thinly veiled threats of force. Elias stood before him, his stance wide, his face a mask of stone. His own flaws, his deep-seated distrust of authority, his history of running collided with his fierce, unyielding protectiveness of Ayana. He saw the flash of primal fear in her eyes, a reflection of every nightmare she had ever endured. He remembered the feel of her trembling hand, the tentative trust she had placed in him, and a cold fury coiled in his gut. The agent spoke of law, of order, of the white man's burden. Elias spoke of humanity, of a child's right to safety, of the unbreakable bond that now defined their lives. It was a confrontation not just of men, but of worldviews, of conflicting claims to dignity and belonging. The settlers watched, their faces grim, knowing the precariousness of their own existence. The agent's voice rose, sharp and imperious, threatening to bring in more men, to level the settlement if necessary. Elias, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, refused to yield. The standoff stretched, tense and brittle, the fate of Ayana hanging in the balance, a symbol of countless lives caught in the grinding gears of history. The confrontation, though momentarily diffused by the steadfast unity of the Métis community, left an indelible mark, a stark reminder of the fragile nature of their sanctuary. The agent retreated, his threats echoing, a promise of future, relentless pursuit. Elias knew their time in the Red River settlement, though precious, was finite. The world was too vast, the reach of the government too long for them to ever truly settle in one place without constant fear. Yet, in the aftermath of that tense standoff, something profound had shifted. Ayana, who had clung to Elias's leg throughout the ordeal, now looked at him with an unwavering depth of understanding. Her hand, small yet resolute, found his and squeezed it. In that simple gesture there was a silent promise, an unspoken acknowledgement of their shared fate, and a profound, nascent love that transcended blood or law. They were family, not by accident or obligation, but by fierce, undeniable choice. Elias, once a man adrift, now carried the steadying weight of purpose. He saw with stark clarity that their resolution lay not in finding a perfect, permanent haven, but in creating a portable one, a sanctuary built within themselves, in their bond. Their journey continued, not as a flight from fear, but as a deliberate forging of a new path. They learned to adapt, to find beauty in impermanence, to extract joy from the smallest shared moments. Ayana, growing taller, her voice stronger, began to share stories of her Pawnee ancestors, blending them with the Métis tales Elias recounted, weaving a new, vibrant tapestry of identity. Elias, for his part, found a redemption he had never sought, his flaws not erased but softened, transformed by the relentless demands of unconditional love. They never truly escaped the shadows of the past, the echoes of prejudice and loss, but they learned to walk through them, hand in hand, their connection a beacon in the encroaching darkness. Their ending was not a flourish of definitive triumph, but a quiet, enduring whisper of hope. They had found not a haven of perfect peace, but a haven within each other, a chosen family forged in the crucible of despair, capable of facing any horizon, together.